Imagine it's Christmas Eve, and the warm glow of lights fills the windows of every home in the neighborhood. There's laughter, the smell of roasted turkey in the air, and the sound of carols echoing from house to house. But while most families are gathered around their tables, one home stands quiet, cold, and dim. It's the house of Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who lives just down the street. She's always been alone, rarely seen outside her house, and never has visitors. But tonight, something extraordinary is about to happen that will change everything. Meet Daniel, a kind-hearted boy with big dreams and a heart full of compassion. Despite his young age, he notices things that many people overlook. As he walks home with his family, excited about their upcoming Christmas dinner, he can't help but notice Mrs. Jenkins's house, empty, lonely, and dark. There's a tug at his heart, a feeling he can't shake. For as long as Daniel can remember, Mrs. Jenkins has been a mystery in their neighborhood. Some say she's just grumpy and prefers to be left alone, but Daniel has always believed there's more to her story. As he watches the families around him gathering for their festive feasts, an idea sparks in his mind. What if Mrs. Jenkins wasn't meant to spend Christmas alone? What if, for once, someone invited her to join in the warmth and joy of the holiday? Without overthinking it, Daniel makes a decision that surprises even himself. He's going to invite her to his family's Christmas dinner. With a mix of nerves and determination, Daniel walks up the cracked stone path to Mrs. Jenkins's door. His heart races, unsure of how she'll respond. Will she be upset, tell him to leave, or maybe even ignore him completely? But Daniel knows this is the right thing to do. After all, no one should be alone on Christmas. When he knocks, the sound echoes in the stillness, and for a moment, nothing happens. But then, the door creaks open, and there she is, Mrs. Jenkins, peeking through the small gap, her eyes tired but filled with curiosity. "Hello, Mrs. Jenkins. My family and I are having Christmas dinner, and, well, we'd love for you to join us," Daniel says, with a hopeful smile. The silence that follows feels like forever. Mrs. Jenkins doesn't say anything at first, just looks at him, as if she's trying to figure out if he's serious. And then, slowly, a soft smile appears on her face, one that Daniel has never seen before. She agrees, much to his relief and surprise. That evening, Mrs. Jenkins sits at their table, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and food she hasn't had in years. She shares stories from her past, stories no one had ever heard, and for the first time in what feels like forever, she doesn't feel so alone. Daniel watches her, realizing that this simple invitation has done more than just brighten her holiday. It's brought back a spark to her eyes. But as the night comes to an end, Mrs. Jenkins does something unexpected. She pulls Daniel aside, reaching into her pocket. "Thank you," she says, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "You have no idea what this night means to me. I want you to have this." She hands him a small box, wrapped in a piece of old but beautiful paper, the edges worn with time. Daniel looks at it, confused and curious. What could be inside? Why is this so important to her? Before he can ask any questions, she smiles, gives him a gentle pat on the shoulder, and quietly leaves into the night. Daniel stands there, staring at the box, wondering what kind of gift it could be. Why would Mrs. Jenkins, who had so little, give him something in return? What was the significance behind this mysterious gift? He doesn't open it right away, too caught up in the moment to think clearly. But little does Daniel know, that small box holds something far more valuable than he could ever imagine. And as he finally unwraps it later, what he finds inside will change his life forever. But what exactly did Mrs. Jenkins leave him? And how could a simple act of kindness on Christmas Eve lead to such a profound and life-altering gift? Stay tuned, because the answer is coming, and it's something you won't want to miss. In the days following Christmas, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Jenkins and the mysterious box she'd given him. He hadn't opened it yet, unsure why he was hesitating. Something about it felt personal, like a secret she had trusted him with. But what could it be? His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was something sentimental from her past, or a small token of appreciation. Whatever it was, he knew it wasn't just a simple gift. There was more to it. Mrs. Jenkins had always been a figure of mystery in the neighborhood. She had lived in that old house for as long as Daniel could remember, but no one really knew her story. Some neighbors whispered that she had lost her family a long time ago, while others said she preferred to live in isolation, not wanting to bother with the world outside. But after that Christmas dinner, Daniel saw her in a different light. She wasn't just a lonely old woman. There was warmth in her, a spark that had been hidden for too long. As the days passed, Daniel's curiosity grew. One evening, after finishing his homework, he sat on his bed and pulled the small box from his drawer. It felt surprisingly heavy for its size. His fingers ran over the worn edges of the wrapping paper, and with a deep breath, he finally unwrapped it. Inside was an old, delicate key. It looked ancient, with intricate patterns carved into the metal. Daniel stared at it, confused. What could this key possibly unlock? Why had Mrs. Jenkins given it to him? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper meaning behind it. Was it connected to her past? Did it unlock something in her house? A place filled with stories from her life. His thoughts spiraled, and before he knew it, he was standing at his window, looking toward her house. The house seemed different now, less cold and distant. He needed to find out the truth. The next day, Daniel decided to visit Mrs. Jenkins. He knocked on her door, but there was no answer. He waited a few minutes, knocked again, but still nothing. Worried, he asked a few neighbors if they had seen her, but no one had. Days turned into a week, and still no sign of her. It was as if she had disappeared. Daniel's concern grew, and so did his sense of responsibility. What if something had happened to her? What if the key was her way of telling him something important before she left? Daniel couldn't let it go. He needed answers. One evening, after much thought, he made a decision. He would use the key to find out what Mrs. Jenkins had left behind for him. He felt conflicted about going into her house, but deep down, he knew she had given him the key for a reason. It wasn't just a random gesture. It was a message. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, Daniel made his way to Mrs. Jenkins's house. The door creaked as he opened it, and a faint chill filled the air. Inside, the house was quiet, filled with the soft scent of old wood and dust. He had never been inside before. The furniture was old but well kept, and family photos lined the walls. Photos of a younger Mrs. Jenkins, smiling with people Daniel had never seen before. Who were they? Her family? Friends? He wandered through the house, his heart pounding in his chest, and then, at the end of a long hallway, he saw it. A small locked door that looked out of place. His hands shook as he pulled the key from his pocket and fitted into the lock. It clicked open with ease, revealing a small room, dimly lit by the fading sunlight through a cracked window. Inside, the room was filled with old boxes, letters, and papers scattered on a desk. Danielle's eyes scanned the room until they landed on a framed photograph sitting on the desk. It was a picture of a young boy, smiling brightly, standing next to a much younger Mrs. Jenkins. Daniel froze, staring at the photo. The boy in the picture looked strangely familiar, almost like him. His mind raced as he picked up the photo, turning it over to find a date written on the back. The year was long before Daniel was born. Was this Mrs. Jenkins's son? Or someone else important in her life? And why did he look so much like Daniel? As he stood there, piecing together the fragments of a life he never knew, something clicked in Daniel's mind. The loneliness Mrs. Jenkins had carried with her all these years wasn't just about being old and isolated. It was about loss. This boy in the photo, whoever he was, had been a part of her life, and somehow Daniel reminded her of him. The weight of the situation sank in as Daniel realized the connection. Mrs. Jenkins hadn't just seen him as a kind neighbor. She had seen something deeper, something that reminded her of a bond she had lost long ago. And the key she gave him, it wasn't just to unlock this room. It was to unlock the memories she had kept hidden for so long. Memories she was finally ready to share. But why now? Why had she waited all these years to open up? And more importantly, where was she? Daniel's heart raced as he unfolded the letter. The words on the paper seemed to blur together as his hands trembled, but he forced himself to focus, knowing that this letter would hold the answers to the questions swirling in his mind. "Dear Daniel," it began, "there's something you need to know." He took a deep breath and continued reading. "You remind me so much of someone I once loved dearly. My son Matthew. You've probably seen his picture by now. He was about your age when he passed away, many years ago. He was my world. And when I lost him, it felt like I lost everything. I locked this room and shut myself away from the world, trying to forget the pain. I didn't want to feel anymore, didn't want to let anyone close. But then you came along. Every time I saw you playing outside, laughing with your family, it reminded me of Matthew. It was painful at first, but over time, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years: hope. You didn't just remind me of him. You brought back something I thought was lost forever, a sense of connection. When you invited me to Christmas dinner, it was the first time in so long that I didn't feel alone. You have no idea what that meant to me. I wanted to give you something. In return, something that meant as much to me as that evening did. That's why I gave you the key to this room. It holds memories I've been too scared to face for so long. But I believe you're the right person to carry them forward. You see, Daniel, Matthew had a dream to become a writer, to share stories that would inspire people. He never got the chance. But I found some of his unfinished work here in this room, along with ideas he scribbled down. I think you could help bring those stories to life in your own way. You've got the same spark in you that he had. The kindness, the curiosity, I can see it. I hope you can take these stories and make something of them. I believe it's what Matthew would have wanted. Thank you, Daniel, for showing me that even in the darkest of times, there's always light. Daniel sat down, the letter resting on his lap. As the weight of her words sank in, he felt a deep connection, not only to Mrs. Jenkins, but also to Matthew, a boy he had never met, but now felt linked to through the stories he had left behind. The key wasn't just to unlock the room. It was to unlock a path forward, one where Daniel could take Matthew's dreams and carry them forward in his own way. Over the next few days, Daniel spent hours in that small room, going through the papers, reading Matthew's notes, and discovering the unfinished stories. Each page held a glimpse of a boy who had been full of ideas, creativity, and passion. Daniel was amazed by how much Matthew's imagination seemed to mirror his own. It wasn't easy, but with every story he worked on, Daniel felt a growing sense of purpose. He started writing his own versions of Matthew's ideas, blending them with his own thoughts and experiences. And slowly, the pieces began to come together. What had once been a room full of forgotten memories was now a space where new stories were being born. and Daniel felt closer to Mrs. Jenkins and Matthew than ever. One afternoon, as he was finishing the first story, Daniel heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find Mrs. Jenkins standing there, her eyes filled with warmth and gratitude. She looked frailer than before, but there was a peace about her that Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. "I knew you'd do something special with those stories," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Daniel. You've brought more joy to me than you'll ever know." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment he couldn't quite put into words. "It's not just me, it's Matthew's stories too. He had a gift, and I'm just helping to finish what he started." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, tears welling in her eyes. He would be proud. I'm proud too. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued to write and share the stories, and they began to gain attention in his community. People were drawn to the heartfelt messages within them, the sense of hope and connection they brought. And through it all, Daniel realized something important. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change lives in ways you never expect. What had started as a simple Christmas invitation had blossomed into something far greater. Mrs. Jenkins was no longer the lonely figure in the neighborhood. She was a friend, a mentor, and a source of inspiration. And Matthew's legacy, once locked away in a forgotten room, was now alive again, touching the hearts of those around them. As Daniel stood in front of his computer, preparing to share the next chapter of Matthew's stories online, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. A key, a box, a single act of kindness. These were the things that had changed his life forever. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all.